Good morning and welcome to the UC Berkeley Library's webinar series, Collecting Conversations, Academic Libraries, and Research in Flux. This webinar series is dedicated to various aspects of librarianship, which pervade our daily lives as academic librarians. And I wanted to first take a quick minute to thank the UC Berkeley Library Administration for inspiring us as employees in these dynamic times to think creatively on how to provide services to our end users. A special note of thanks to the Dean of the Libraries, Dr. Jeffrey Mackey Mason, and senior leadership team, which consists of Senior Associate University Librarian Elizabeth Dupuy, Joanne Ramirez, Salva Ismail. And I wanted to start with further ado and present our guest introductory speaker who will provide opening remarks, Elaine L. Westbrooks. Since 2017, she has been the Vice Provost of University Libraries and University Librarian at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is responsible for the leadership and general administration of the university libraries, which include 9 libraries with approximately 300 librarians, archivists, and staff. Westbrooks is a member of the Association of Research Libraries Scholars and Scholarship Committee, the Executive Committee of Triangle Research Libraries Network, the Digital Public Library of America Board of Directors, and the Hathi Trust Board of Governors. She has a BA in Linguistics and an MLIS from the University of Pittsburgh. Elaine, welcome to the webinar, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say I am really excited to be here. And again, I would like to thank the administration of UC Berkeley Library. So shout out to Jeff Mackey Mason, the university librarian, Elizabeth Dupuy, and also all of you that have gone through all this trouble to put this event together. I know it's a great deal of work and I really appreciate all that you've done. I also have to give another shout out to UC folks because you've done some amazing, audacious work when it comes to open access and scholarly communications. So since I know many of you are from the UC system, I just have to thank you for your wonderful work. It's because of your work that enabled institutions like mine to take some really bold actions as we begin to negotiate with publishers and think about the future of scholarly communications and what we can do as a community. So the fight is definitely not over, but I want to thank all of you for that. So we're all being faced with a dual pandemic. And the dual pandemic we're faced with is racism and COVID-19. And these past 10 months have been completely surreal for all of us. Like many of you, I've tried to remain sane by taking up new hobbies, making cheese, doing things like that. I'm doing a lot more reading than I used to. And so I have to say that it's been quite a learning experience. But while I'm trying to stay sane, I'm very much focused on how do I lead an organization? How do we be a digital library or research library in a digital age in the midst of the racism that's going on, as well as a pandemic, a global pandemic. And that's really challenging. And I don't know about you, but I did not receive any education or training on how to lead in the middle of a pandemic or 2 pandemics, to be clear. So this is one of these things where we're all trying to figure out things as we go along, and it's challenging. I mean, that's the best way that we could say it. But to kick off this webinar, I'd like to reflect on 3 themes that have been on my mind for the past 10 months. The first theme that I want to reflect on is about equity. When it comes to this pandemic, we are all in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. So I want to repeat that. We're in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. The fact that Black Americans are twice as likely to die from COVID-19 is a problem. The Bureau of Labor Statistics released its employment report for September, which showed that women have been choosing to leave the workforce in staggering numbers. So while approximately 220,000 men have dropped out of the workforce in the month of September, nearly 1 million women have made the same decision. This is a problem. The third example I'll use is the digital divide and that impact that it's having on learners of all ages, whether it's school age and the homework gap, but the inability of large communities who are no longer able to engage in this remote learning, or maybe they were never able to engage in this remote learning because they don't have the technology, they don't have broadband, they live in rural communities. This is a problem. And so what we're saying is this pandemic has really highlighted the significant inequities in our society. So the second theme I want to bring up is a theme I'm calling truth and memory. And I believe that libraries and archives are in the business of truth and memory. And if this is truly the case, we cannot sit by on the sidelines when we see injustice. And so that means we have to confront the difficult topics of racism, white supremacy, and inequity. And I think it's important to think about what institutions do, what groups do, and what our society does. It tells you a lot when you see what a society chooses to remember and what a society chooses to forget. Who do we choose to memorialize and who do we choose to erase? We have a responsibility to acknowledge that the scholarly record is incomplete. It has excluded the voices of many for decades. The way that we have centered whiteness in our practices of description and collection building must be questioned. What are we going to do about this? The third theme I'd like to bring up is democracy and what it means to us. Democracy and what should a civic society look like for all Americans. Libraries are the cornerstone of democracy. And year after year, the library is often rated as the #2 trusted institution in America. And so while government, Congress, banks, the trust in those institutions is going down, but the trust in libraries is going up. And that says a lot. And how people working in libraries, like many of us in higher ed, how are we ensuring that the most important aspects of democracy remain strong? So I have to say that most of us want to put 2020 in our rearview mirror. I mean, to be frank, it's been a shitty year, right? And I also wonder if I could just get a pill or a drink and just go to sleep and not wake up till like February 2021. But we all know that can't happen. And I'm not aware of that pill or that drink existing right now. But I have to say that the tragedies of racism and the pandemic have highlighted to me what really matters. I haven't seen my parents since January. Family matters. I took democracy for granted. Our democracy is not finished. It has not been perfected. In fact, it is fragile and we have to fight for it. The pandemic has reminded me that we live on the plane of aspiration of what our country can be. Democracy matters. And then finally, we've been talking about diversity for decades, but it took these tragedies to pivot from diversity and really talk about equity and inclusion. And so despair is a luxury and a privilege that I can't afford. And so hope is a discipline that I'm going to rely on to get me through this next week, the rest of the year, and the next 2 years, because this pandemic is going to linger and we are going to have to learn to live with it. What I can also say is the work that libraries do is critical more than ever. The work we do to help citizens or our students become global citizens is really important. The work that we're doing in open access and how information and knowledge should be freely available. The research coming out of the University of California and my university and all universities should be open and accessible to everyone. And that means that we need to belly up to these important topics, and we have to focus on the fight for justice. And so this is the challenge that I leave all of you today. So as I give you those 3 themes to think about, we have a great set of panelists who I imagine are going to touch on some of those themes, but also they might be touching on resiliency, collaboration, sustainability, and wellness, because all of these are things that we're all thinking about right now. But you're in for a treat. We have 5 great panelists from universities all over the country who are going to talk about what they've learned in administering this, their organizations in the middle of these 2 pandemics. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm going to turn it back to Lilidar, who will introduce our first panelist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for your really inspirational opening. You know, I tried not to get so emotional, but your words hit the heart directly. And frankly speaking, I'm very grateful for your opening remarks. Believe me, I usually don't get like this, but I have shaken up because you're outspoken, and I appreciate that. So our next speaker is David Magier. David has been Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Communications, Scholarly Collections and Research Services, I beg your pardon, at Princeton University since 2008, a specialist in South Asian studies. He had previously served for 22 years in library management at Columbia University as Director of Area Studies, Director of Center for Human Rights Documentation and Research, and South and Southeast Asia librarians. As a member of library's senior leadership team at Princeton, Dr. Magier plays a central role in establishing library-wide strategic priorities and policies, program development, and resource allocation. The sphere of his responsibilities encompasses strategic leadership for his 150 staff, including 4 department heads, 10 branch libraries, and about 55 subject specialist librarians across the system. David, the floor is yours. And
thanks so much, Lilidar, and thank you to Elaine Westbrooks. That was, I agree with Lilidar, very inspiring opening for this webinar. I'm going to speak a little bit about what I've observed as a leader at Princeton and the challenges in responding to what's been one of the most fundamentally transformative periods in my entire career in librarianship. My challenge right now is how to describe all that in 12 minutes, but here I go. Basically, I want to start by talking about our experience at Princeton and then move on to what we've learned as the pandemic unfolded and as we tried to fulfill our standard mission in non-standard ways. There were really 4 phases of how campus was operating based on very dynamic changes coming from the governor's executive orders in New Jersey, the university guidelines, things that we were hearing from the media, things our patrons were hearing, and the library's own quick attempts to adjust to the changing scenarios. Phase 1 was a campus lockdown. It was a full lockdown in the early spring. All the buildings were locked. Phase 2 enabled limited staff access to some campus buildings, including the libraries. Phase 3 was limited patron access to the libraries. And phase 4 is full access to the library, quote unquote, return to normal, if we ever get there. We're not in phase 4, trust me. I want to outline both the key services that we scrambled to try to keep providing to our patrons under those changing circumstances through the 4 phases or the 3 phases so far. And then also talk about the back office functions in order to make those services possible. First of all, patrons needed, now more than ever, access to expertise. They needed research support and assistance of all kinds. Second, they needed access to content in the library physically, the content that is available digitally. And then third, they need and have needed, but couldn't get for long periods, access to library spaces. Princeton is not really an urban center where we have large student populations living around campus. It's all on campus. And to the extent that students were still on campus, many of them were sort of stuck in dorm rooms during lockdowns. What they really needed was access to library spaces in order to carry out their study or for browsing the stacks, et cetera. Now, the back office functions that we attempted to fulfill with varying degrees of success over time, acquisitions of new material to get it out there where it could be accessible, cataloging, obviously, physical processing, shelving and reshelving of circulated materials, and overall fulfillment of requests for particular items. So let me talk in a little bit of detail how we adjusted each of those functions under the different unfolding phases of this crazy pandemic. And the first thing that happened is all of us in the library leadership team were basically spending all day and all night on Zoom calls with each other, frantically trying to figure out how to connect the dots and how to make all this happen. I'm sure that's a common experience across all the libraries here. It was dynamically changing. We needed to communicate to the patrons. We needed to communicate to the faculty. We needed to communicate to the administration. And we were getting mixed messages about the current state of affairs, what we could do and what we couldn't do minute by minute. So it was really challenging. In phase one, which was in the early spring, most of the students were sent home. The campus was locked down. There were grad students who stayed on campus because they were living in graduate student housing with their families in their own apartments. We created what we called the LETF, the Library Emergency Task Force, which pulled together people from across our different operational units. And this is how that period might be characterized. In terms of the back office, we had approval plans that were still shipping books. We couldn't stop them midstream. They were piling up and nobody could open even the doors to, let alone unpack the boxes, even just get them into the library. So we had mountains of material piling up untouched. The students were home, but still needed more than ever, as I said, support and some kind of access to content. So our remote services really geared up because we had everybody working from home. We had our subject specialists providing chat reference, extended hours with chat reference, more staffing for chat reference, research consultations by our more than 50 subject specialists, remote bibliographic instruction, special workshops on finding and using online resources, bibliographic management tools, and so on. In terms of access to digital content, we had teams working together with collection development department, acquisitions, and resource sharing interlibrary loan. Basically, we were looking at existing e-resources that we were already providing, and we were pointing patrons to those. We were purchasing ebooks on demand. We, of course, attempted to stop all acquisitions of print since the print collections were locked down. We were fast tracking ebooks right into the catalog. So typically in less than 12 hours, we would get a request, buy the book, and expose it through our catalog with a link to the full text. Many publishers and vendors, as many of you might be aware, during this period, fortunately, were providing temporary access to their e-journals and e-books. And we had teams that were scouring publishers' websites to locate those sources and to consolidate them into our websites for our patrons so they could find content that was newly available electronically. And then, of course, eventually we got the HathiTrust Emergency Temporary Access Service, which enabled access to ebooks from Hathi collection it's a complicated system under many conditions. I won't go into detail here, but we immediately added a widget to all the ETAS books into our catalog so that our programmers played with the catalog endlessly, and they were able to bring up the ETAS access right away for our patrons to find those books. Later in the spring, we went into phase 2, where we knew this was coming, limited access for staff only into the library. We had to establish safety protocols, traffic controls, wayfinding for staff, roping off areas, density controls, social distancing, required online training courses, and weekly testing, COVID testing of all staff who were authorized to be on campus for 8 hours or more. We redeployed staff into new tasks, revised workflows, scanning, and scanning, more scanning than ever before. And acquisitions functions, obviously, we started opening up the mountain of boxes, paying invoices, and processing books to get them on the shelves. I'm going to speed up because my countdown timer tells me I'm not going to make it in 12 minutes unless I get really fast. So expanded patron access to content during phase 2. For all our remote patrons, we added a button into the catalog called Request for Scanning. And with the staff being able to get in the library, we were putting all kinds of staff at all levels of staffing, pulling books from the stacks and sitting at scanners and digitizing them. Digitization processing was subject to a cascading fulfillment decision tree. And we also developed a controlled digital lending system, CDL, for whole book provision of in-copyright books. So we were looking at owned ebooks, purchased ebooks, ETAS ebooks, and digitization. And here I want to mention the democratization of access. For books that were in the public domain, we set it up by default. When we scanned them, we created an open access immediately for those, for the world to access and to get full downloadable PDFs. If the book was in copyright, our CDL system enabled one patron, one page at a time, no full downloading. And that's because of the regulations for that kind of access. For faculty and students still on campus, we had to account for how we were going to serve them. And we added a request for pickup button into the catalog. That button enabled them to say, I need this book. We had staff pulling again and putting them out on tables out front, already charged out to them where they could come and pick them up. Note though, that during most of this period, almost all interlibrary loan and resource sharing functions were at a standstill. All the libraries were in the same state as we were. We're not able to provide other libraries' content to our patrons. We had at some point a hard decision to make. Because of the rules for HATI, emergency temporary access, we decided to turn off HATI, ETAS, in order for those people on campus to be able to use the physical books, because ETAS requires that you not circulate the books that are provided digitally from HATI. Rapidly now, in phase 3, basically starting in the fall semester, we had only grad students, faculty, and a very small number of undergrads on campus, but we started allowing limited patron access to the library through a seats reservation system, against much more complex safety protocols, traffic controls, and testing of patrons, and requiring them to undergo safety training courses online. There was a tremendous complexity in determining who's supposed to get access. Because remember, we have all kinds of categories here, and we had these intersecting and sometimes conflicting guidance from different components at the university, at the state, from the governor. So the library was attempting to implement all of this with categories like authorized to be on campus, alumni, emeritus faculty, visiting scholars, undergrads living nearby, etc. All of this depended on data, and we didn't have consistent data streams on who had taken the training, who had gotten tested, who was authorized to be on campus. It was really, really hard. And the net result is complaints galore. Complaints coming into the library, to the university librarian, complaints to the president. What do you mean? I've been here for 30 years. How can I not be authorized? So I'm going to wrap up very quickly now. If I can go slightly over my 12 minutes. I hate to do that. But I'll just mention in passing, we had further great complexity in organizing for course reserves for the fall courses entirely online, massive amounts of digitization, lots of challenges in terms of communication with the faculty themselves, who were struggling to get used to teaching online. We provided as much consultation and assistance as we could. We did eventually resume the PATI ETAS because we negotiated, we were part of a deal that they said, if you are providing limited browsing to the ETAS books, it's okay. People can physically have the books in their hands in the library, and you can still make those accessible electronically. So I want to do a very quick bullet point adjustment, if I may, of the overview of what we achieved and with some examples of numbers as of last month. We launched a book pickup service, as I mentioned, with received an average of 650 requests per week. We implemented an online seat reservation system that's received over 2,000 reservations since we launched in mid-August. We made our seats available to patrons by installing plexiglass barriers, posting wayfinding information signs, and facilitating social distancing. We utilized hover cams and overhead cameras so that people could do remote teaching with objects, like with our special collections and rare books. We initiated controlled digital lending, as I explained, and expanded our digitization service, which now is receiving about 800 requests per week, including full book and partial book. We have a remote storage facility called Recap with our partners Columbia, Harvard, New York Public Library, and Princeton, and we have been able to resume sharing our collections, fulfilled nearly 11,000 retrieval requests from Princeton patrons alone. We've cleared numerous backlogs of the books that arrived. We fielded over 3,000 reference and chat inquiries from all over the world. We provided virtual library instruction, consultation, presentations, and workshops for over 5,000 patrons. We held 175 virtual workshops and seminars, produced more than 100 instructional videos. We launched an e-newsletter, and we continue to carry out some important digitization projects. But I want to just close now briefly and talk about what we learned and what we haven't learned, if I can get your indulgence to keep going. The key thing we've learned is that we are more flexible than we ever imagined we could be. We're a bureaucracy like every other large research library, and basically all our prior policies and understandings about staffing and all of that gets thrown out, and we rethink everything from scratch, and we have to be really agile in doing so. We redeploy staff with totally new tasks, and we had to jump into action to train them to do things they never did before. And we, basically we've learned that a lot of what we had always done in person can be carried out quite effectively remotely. And we're even considering the possibility that maybe a lot of teleworking can continue indefinitely into the future. We are exploring lots of new lessons to understand what the new normal may look like. We're tweaking and refining all our workflows for request and fulfillment, lots more preemptive digitization. Finally, I want to end on a note about our staff. Our staff have been spectacular. We were worried that, people would just refuse to come in because they were afraid of exposure, understandably, but actually the opposite. They were dying to find ways to come in and work in the library. The people hated to sit home idle. They wanted to be part of how we serve our patrons. I want to just mention, finally, the impacts of the total environment on our staffing. It's a mounting cumulative stress, anxiety, and emotional fragility. The psychic impact of the pandemic, but also hurricanes, floods, wildfires, political chaos and instability, racist violence, economic collapse, financial insecurity, unreliability of technical systems we used to trust, and so on. The challenge for library leadership is really how to provide ample empathy, care, and personalized assistance, how to provide resources and training for people to engage in self-care and care for each other, sensitivity to structural racism and other forms of bias, and how to organize for maximum flexibility to acknowledge all the different ways that the current environment is seriously impinging on the lives of our staff. I'll end there, and I do apologize, I went a couple of minutes over.
Thank you, David, for your presentation. Um, it is a great honor for me to introduce sort of my mentor, an exemplary leader, and an undaunted librarian. That's the way I describe our next speaker. She continues to lead me and lead rest of the team. And you all see her. Her name is Elizabeth Dupuy or Beth Dupuy. She's the Senior Associate University Librarian at the University of California, Berkeley. Beth's portfolio includes leadership for libraries' educational initiatives, user services, and more than a dozen of the campus libraries. Since March, she has been leading the library's planning and implementation of remote and on-site services during the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Beth. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the great comments from the people who've already spoken today. I think it's going to get harder for each of us as we go to note the things that are different. So I'm going to change up so much of what I had planned to say because I think so much of it resonates. Just as a bit of context, the University of California, Berkeley is located across the bay from San Francisco on a campus with 31,000 undergraduates and about 12,000 graduate students and about 1,500 faculty. Our campus has about 24 campus libraries. I oversee most of them, but not all of them. And they're a complex arrangement of how they report to different entities. We have also about 400 librarians and staff and about 500 student library employees when things are all normal. As Elaine mentioned, our chancellor too often uses the phrase, we are in the same storm, different boats. And that resonates so much with me as well. And as I prepared for today's talk, I thought a lot about how that's also true for our libraries. Very often as we've gone through all of our conversations on campus with library staff, they're mentioning, have you seen what Library X is doing? Or have you heard about the service at Library Y? And does this institution, why are they doing this differently than you've chosen to do it here? And I think that one of the important parts that is hard to remember is that in our regions, we are guided by very different decisions at the state and county and city levels. And then our campus leadership also chooses to interpret those guidelines in different ways. And so we don't all operate under the same set of instructions. We're kind of working at different games, even though we're experiencing kind of the same coronavirus experience. The options we have and the limitations we have are actually quite different. Just like Washington State, which I always think of the harbinger of all this, we were watching how their university cleverly adapted to the challenges up there very early on. California saw the COVID cases very early out here on the West Coast. Partly, you remember maybe way back then, the docking of cruise ships that brought people back in and where they were going to put them, partly because of our population density. At the end of February, there was an early case in a neighboring county. And that's what started our campus really kind of making this real and thinking about how that would relate to campus. So by the end of February, there were lots of conversations here planning, and a campus-wide announcement went out about how campus leaders were proactively preparing for public health changes and discussing best practices where we could sustain research and teaching and learning in an environment that I don't think any of us could have pictured. I remember at that time looking and Googling pictures of libraries in China who would set up plastic shields around carrels and thinking, we're not going to do that. Or how would that work to come into the library? And of course, wow, we all have really adapted and dramatically changed how we work. It's also amazing to think how much the time over these last several months, you lose track of how much we've really experienced. There was so much sense of ambiguity. We still have that, I guess, but at the beginning of all this, there were no clear guidelines for what these chapters or phases would be. And as David mentioned, their campus came up with a series of steps or phases to look forward. We were all developing those same kinds of frameworks. On our campus, we call them chapters because we're a library, and that helped us think of them in terms of 5 chapters we would move through as we progressed. Talking about how we might have to go back and reread a chapter instead of just linearly progressing through our framework necessarily. But I remember at that time too that some of our staff were very anxious. They were seeing news stories and hearing about things happening and wondering if we were going to make changes and when. and wondering if the library was really looking out for them. And so fast forwarding a little bit, as luck had it, or misfortune, or whatever, may you live in interesting times. On March 12th, I stepped into the interim role of being acting university librarian on our campus for a couple weeks while our university librarian was out of the country. And it was a once in a lifetime, I hope, opportunity to lead an organization through an unprecedented amount of turbulence. At that time, we had just convinced campus to let us start to reduce our library hours to spring break hours, which are kind of a shortened business hour period. But lots of staff were still saying that's not enough. You need to do more. You need to close more. We shouldn't be here. Are we doing the right thing having spaces open to students still? And so there were still more conversations that happened behind the scenes with campus leaders to talk about the pros and cons. And I guess that's one of my key takeaways from all this is, in some ways, I've been very fortunate to be on the inside of the campus conversations, looking at people who I truly feel have a great compassion and a really profound commitment to serving our students and faculty well. The decisions that come out sometimes are not the ones people hope to hear. Somebody would like to go back to their office sooner, but they really are doing it, in my estimation, on our campus, having weighed many factors and really with the best interests at heart. And I think that's what's kept up my spirit during this time of thinking that we really are working towards a great cause and with a campus that truly cares, a campus that has been cautious and maybe more cautious than some people would have liked at times, but has invested a lot in testing and setting up structures and ways for us to do contact tracing and other elements that will help us actually really look to the longer term of how to stem the tide of outbreaks and make changes so we can actually get back to thinking more about our services and operations and less about just surviving on campus. In terms of that, I will say, Eric, our campus developed, our provost has done an amazing job of sharing information. And so one of the lessons I've learned is sort of the issue of transparency and communication at all levels. On our campus, they are very open about where they stand, what they're thinking about certain practices or policies for the next semester. It is we're a complex place, just like everyone else is. And so it's messy and it's complicated and it takes a long time, but they do get input when they're thinking about what should spring instruction look like? How should we handle spring break and times that we come back? What sort of levels of essential research are we supporting and which kinds of things should fall in which categories or what process should work? And they have set up different groups, one on research, one on instruction, one on operations. And I'm pleased to say that the library has an associate director on each of those groups that then knows what's happening, can inform, help raise issues, help troubleshoot or problem solve, and also be able to bring back ideas to the rest of our campus leadership as things are in process. So we're not just surprised at the last minute and always reacting to decisions made. And I think that's been a really important part of what our campus leadership has done. I wanted to share too, I know I don't have much time, so one of the highlights, I guess I would say for me, is our campus's approach to how we think about this process. And early on in April, after we'd all been ushered home, we had 3 hours notice in March to leave campus and be out by 5. And we thought we would be gone for 3 weeks. So we gave everyone the direction of how to power down their offices and clean out refrigerators and lock up book drops and change systems and change hours and post signs, and then go home, which we thought was for 3 weeks. So people prepared very differently for that. At the same time, we started thinking about most of these staff that we have do not have jobs that naturally translate to work they can do at home. If you were used to working at a circulation desk, it's now very confusing what you might do next. So we spent our first months actually talking with people about what kinds of projects we could set up and have them work on that were meaningful projects that the library needed to have done. We also asked staff who had time, who within their normal job, had some amount of time that they weren't committed yet. Some of our librarians who are liaisons and selectors, it was easy to translate their time into working and consulting online or leading workshops or figuring out how to do that work. But for some of our staff, it wasn't. And so from that list is how we built our what we call 2020 models team. And the group of people that helped lead what we were going to do next turned out to be a lot of our staff positions from all across the organization in different levels of expertise, from preservation and from circulation, and some people who were student supervisors. And it was a really amazing group of people that helped develop our framework and importantly helped develop our principles for how we were going to act. I won't have time to go over all of them now, but I will say it was important as we came up with them, not only what they were, but the order they were in. And so in the first two principles, they were about committing to adhering to the campus, local, state, and national public health directives, which I know some places are still struggling with. And number two is protecting the safety and well-being of the library workforce. All the other principles we had were certainly around prioritizing Berkeley students, faculty, and staff, and thinking about if they were working remotely, prioritizing the ability for people to be productive remotely, even if there were people locally. So many, about 25% of our students are international or out of state, in addition to the number that don't live in the Bay Area. And so it was important for us to sustain throughout our access to ETAS and so on. I will say we experienced all the same things David did. We weren't getting things delivered. And that was a great stress for many people about where their print items were and how we were going to get them in and how we would start to work through all of the things that had piled up once we could get deliveries in. We are still not offering in-person on-site services for our users to come in and study. That's based on how our campus is set up. The people who are living on site in dorms do have single rooms and places with Wi-Fi and so on. We're starting to still look at a future chapter that would allow us to bring people on site back in person. HathiTrust ETAS has been critical to us, and we have put our efforts towards really supporting course reserves and digitizing on demand for all instructors to make available all readings and all media that they might want to show during this time. And to us, that's really a core issue of affordability and accessibility. There's tons more to say. I meant to say, but I don't have time. So I'm going to stop, and hopefully we'll have more time after this.
Thank you so much, Beth. You should have continued. It was right. It's an interesting way of looking at things and making things clear to all of us. Just a quick announcement to our participants. I see there are questions and questions in live box. We will answer them as soon as all of the panelists present. That way we will have some time to hear individual panelists now, and then we will collectively try to answer as much as we can. So our next speaker, it's also a great honor to have Dr. Greg Yao, who is the president of Center for Research Libraries, he's responsible for setting strategic directions and overall CRL programming and services in collaboration with CRL Board of Directors, CRL staff, CRL member libraries, and CRL strategic partners. Before joining Center for Research Libraries in 2019, he served as the Associate Director for Collections at the MIT Libraries, where he led an administrative portfolio that included scholarly communications and collections strategy, digital preservation, acquisitions, and metadata creation, and the Institute of Archives and Special Collections at Collections. At MIT, he served as a member of editorial board of the MIT Press and as a member of MIT Museum Collections Committee. Previously, Dr. Yao held appointments as Charles Warren Bibliographer at Harvard and as Kaplanov Librarian for American History at the Yale University Library. Yao is a member of American Historical Association, the Greuler Club, and the Society of American Archivists. Thank you very much for presenting, Dr. Yao.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for this invitation. This is just a wonderful way to end the week, so I'm very happy to be here. So I think the topic today is academic libraries and research in flux in this moment of COVID. And during my remarks, I'm going to touch on three categories, three topics. One will be on administrative issues, including personnel management issues. The second category will be collections and services and how the current moment is affecting our thinking about both of those areas. And then the third category, the third subject I'll talk about are about larger shifts that we see in knowledge production and in the academy and activities that we're pursuing in line with those shifts. But before I jump into those, I think it'll be useful for me to say just briefly a word about what is the Center for Research Libraries? What exactly is it? Now, the Center for Research Libraries is a cooperative endeavor of research libraries to build, steward, and disseminate research collections to support research. That's it. It was created in the aftermath of World War II, and as part of that really enormous boom in higher education in the United States. And research libraries in the US realized very quickly that to support this boom in higher education, that they needed to work collaboratively to build the resources, to build the collections, to support that research endeavor, particularly in the area of international collections. And so the Center for Research Libraries was created originally to build international collections to support research. Now, what does that look like today? Well, what that means is that the Center for Research Libraries has over 200 member libraries, research libraries across the United States and across Canada. And we are headquartered here in Chicago. Our location, our physical facility is on the University of Chicago campus, and it's a large research facility. The facility has 5 million analog collections, and that is just part of our collections, which is increasingly digital. So we have a large digital platform and digital delivery platform. Our digital collections are about 50 million items, and they grow at a rate of about 5 million items per year. So the Center for Research Libraries is a cooperative enterprise of research libraries to build, steward, and disseminate research collections with a particular focus on international collections. All of the panelists today are very active members in the Center for Research Libraries, and as well as the University of California at Berkeley. So that's brief context setting for what the Center for Research Libraries is. Now, given the nature of what the Center for Research Libraries is and what we do, I think it would be, you might expect me to jump right in on collections and services in this current moment. But I'm going to start by talking about purely administrative issues and personnel management issues, because if I'm going to be really frank, really straight with you, and say, where have my energies been invested over the last 6 months? Where have the lion's share of my energies professionally, intellectually, and emotionally been? It's in administrative issues to be a responsible leader and steward of the Center for Research Libraries and its local staff, about 50 staff. So what does that mean? That means reevaluating all the liability insurance and making sure our liability insurance coverages are in line with work stoppages. It means that making sure that taking another set of eyes on staff benefits, making sure that the health benefits are in line with the current moment, increasing life insurance benefits for staff in the current moment, applying for CARES funding, putting in a grant for CARES funding through the CARES Act. And receiving funding for that, because we have significant staff that can no longer come into work when we shut down. We got CARES funding so that we didn't have to pursue any furloughs or any layoffs as part of the disruption. Now, my passion professionally is diversity, inclusion, and equity. And usually when I'm talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, I'm thinking about collections, and I'm thinking about services, and I'm thinking about those gaps and what stories and what voices are represented in collections and what's missing. What Elaine was talking about so eloquently at the beginning of this, panel. But over the last 6 months, what's really been taking my energies, and I think justifiably so, it's about caring for the local staff, making sure that I'm being a responsible leader, leading with these values to make sure that there's a strong leadership and empathetic leadership for the CRL community. Now, the research library community is largely a white profession. The last statistics I saw is that within research libraries, it's oftentimes we're over 80%, upwards of 90% white. That's not true at the Center for Research Libraries. My staff's about 50% people of color, 40% Black, And we're located in South Chicago, in the Woodlawn neighborhood. And Woodlawn is about 94% Black. My leadership team at CRL is 66% people of color. So really, taking, really centering diversity, inclusion, equity, and really bringing responsible leadership and empathetic leadership to this community during an incredibly difficult time. Elaine said we're dealing with two pandemics. We're dealing with COVID, but we're also dealing with systemic racism and violence. A profound impact, as you can imagine, on the CRL community here in South Chicago. So when I think about leadership, and I think about administration, and I think about the COVID impact, the last 6 months for me has really been focusing on these management issues, personnel management issues, and leadership of the local community. So I'm happy to talk more about that later in the Q&A. But let's pivot on to collections and services. One of the things I'm really grateful for is that I'm a new leader at CRL, and I'm so grateful that the previous leadership at CRL did so much work over the last 10 years, really building up CRL's digital delivery mechanisms. And so our digital platform, our digital collections, and our ability to do mass digitization, scan on demand, and deliver content to researchers at member libraries digitally is strong. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. As you can imagine, now that we're been up and fully operational since mid-August, the rate of digital demand or scan on demand services is well over it's well over double what it was a year ago, which you would expect given the current situation. But when I look at research collections from a CRL perspective, particularly, and I really center diversity, inclusion, and equity, really center a global mindset international collections, and I look at digital collections and I look at analog collections, I'm concerned about some of our approaches to open access and equity in an openness environment, and also concerned about research libraries' approach to print. When it comes to openness in a digital environment, and it comes to open access, I think that the open access conversations too often center a global north perspective, and I think that the global south needs to be more represented in conversations on open access in a digital environment. There's lots of really great writing on that, but I'll just highlight Alison Mudditt's piece just earlier this week in Scholarly Kitchen. It was really Alison Mudditt, who runs PLOS, wrote a terrific piece in Scholarly Kitchen about the global south need to be more represented in open access. And so that's something that's very, very important to me. And then print. Now we're in a digital age. We're in a digital age, we all know that. But here's the challenge. Print and analog collections have a place, and an important place in a digital age. It may not be this, the print may not loom as large as it did in the distant past, but in some ways, print is an unsurpassed technology for communications. And so how do we right-size the investment in print? How do we steward print collections in a responsible way to meet research needs and to account for the cultural record? It'll be smaller, but it'll be there. How do we do that? So at CRL, to address both of these issues, we have recently charged a new committee, the International Collections and Content Committee. We created a new committee to bring really outstanding experts from the international collections community across the entire CRL research library community. And we've announced the membership. We're about to kick off that group to really bring facilitated leadership to these questions. What does it mean to build global research collections in a digital environment, with a bias towards openness? How do we right-size analog collections, print collections in a responsible way? And how can we use that CRL platform to do that collectively for the benefit of all? David Magyar he's the chair, he's on the CRL board of directors, he's the chair of our collections committee. Pamela Graham is on this new International Collections and Content group. We have representation from Wisconsin. We don't have representation from Berkeley, but we do from UCLA, but we have a fantastic group, and that's something that we are charging and launching to give leadership on these issues in this moment. on collections and services. So that's collections and services. And I'll finish by talking about this larger topic about some trends that I see playing out, larger trends in the academy, in knowledge production. And this may be a little bit out there, but this is what I'm seeing. Now, we're living in a crisis right now. We all know that. We all know that we're living in a crisis moment. But when I take a step back from that and I set aside the COVID moment and I think about crisis, I think it occurs to me that I haven't had a single day in my professional career that hasn't been in the context of crisis. Now, and I've realized in the last couple of years that I've just gone over the threshold where I now think it's official that I'm closer to the end of my career than I am to the beginning of it. I've passed the midpoint. I finished library school in 1998 and I finished a PhD in history in 2007. And in 1998, when I was in library school, we were already talking about the crisis in scholarly communications, the serials crisis. Right, when you look at when you looked at the price of journal content, it was growing at an unsustainable rate. So I was trained before I was a professional librarian. I was already steeped in the ScholComm crisis. I've never known anything but, right? And when it came to being trained as an historian, I've only known the crisis in the humanities. I don't know a humanities environment that hasn't been in crisis, right? And so when I look at this narrative of crisis, not with COVID, that is a crisis. That'll have a beginning and it'll have an end. Crises have beginnings and ends. But when I look at this crisis in ScholComm and knowledge production, and I look at the crisis in humanities, for me, I'm starting to think about those areas as not as crisis, but as condition. It's a condition. And I think that the institutions around knowledge production are stressed in ways where real crisis like COVID will force us to make changes in how those institutions operate. And for me, I'm really thinking about how do research libraries partner with scholarly societies and partner with university presses. How do the different parts of the academy come together to produce knowledge in new ways and to consume knowledge in new ways within the academy? And so one thing that we're pursuing right now is experimenting between new ways of partnering between the Center of Research Libraries and the American Historical Association, research libraries in a scholarly society. Now, for the American Historical Association is really concerned about independent researchers. They have members that are independent researchers that do not have any affiliation with an institution. They do not have access to any research library at all, but they need access to research materials to do their research. And so the American Historical Association is thinking, well, how can they get access to research level collections for their independent scholars? And so right now, the Center for Research Libraries is partnering with them to come up with some experimental membership model where all members of the AHA will have access to CRL collections. Now there's licensing issues to work out, membership issues to work out, all sorts of complications to work out. But I'm keen for the Center of Research Libraries to redefine how research libraries partner with scholarly societies. And going forward, I'd love for us to find ways to partner with them, not just on access to content, but how we're creating content. How are we creating open access monographs? How are we collaborating as different parts of the academy? Because university presses, scholarly societies, research libraries are all in various degrees of crisis or perceived crisis. And I think that outside of a COVID environment, it's a condition. And I think that the condition can be reshaped so that different parts of the academy can be operating in a more healthy dynamic. So that's something I'm keen to support moving forward. So those are three areas I touched on. What we're doing in terms of administration and personnel management, right? Care of staff well-being. Talked about some things we're doing in terms of collections and services, standing up a new administrative layer to bring expert leadership to international collections to address the shared challenges we have as research libraries across the US and Canada. And then also talk about some larger shifts in research production and in the academy generally. And so I look forward to hearing the other presentations and into a Q&A. But thank you so much, Leila, for being here. This is, again, a wonderful way to end the week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg, for your very intense yet thought-provoking presentation. Our next speaker is our own. What do I mean by that? And I'll give her a formal introduction. I want to introduce Leslie Moyo. She is the Associate University Librarian for Public Services at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is also one of our own. I mean it because she finished her MLIS here at UC Berkeley, and so is David. I forgot to mention that he did his PhD here on the campus at Berkeley, and welcome to Berkeley, both Leslie and Moyo virtually. Leslie Moyo and David virtually. As AUL for Public Services, Leslie's portfolio encompasses teaching and learning, reference and liaison support, international and area studies, library spaces, and other areas that have been critical in University of Wisconsin-Madison's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. She is currently leading various COVID-19 planning groups in configuring and delivering library services within the ongoing pandemic environment. Prior to joining UW-Madison, Leslie was professor and director for research and instructional services in the university libraries at Virginia Tech. And prior to that, she was associate librarian and head of the Gateway Libraries at Penn State, where her work in supporting undergraduate learners and researchers in networked electronic environments led to her being named among Library Journal's movers and shakers. As reflected in her research and professional engagements, Leslie has a keen interest in international librarianship, among other areas. She is currently leading the library component of University of Wisconsin-Madison's partnership program with Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. Welcome, Leslie, to this forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking Lilarda and thanking the University of California, Berkeley, for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. And it's really been very interesting to listen to the other presenters and to hear and realize that a lot of what has been happening is really quite similar to what is happening in my institutions and what I have heard also from other institutions that we are partnering with. I would like to speak briefly on the topic of COVID-19 academic disruption and the response of academic libraries. And I'll make these remarks in the context of UW-Madison. I do have one slide, and so I'm just going to share my screen, and I'll just leave that slide on as it provides kind of like an overview of the areas that I'll touch on, and also some of the bullet points that I'll be mentioning as I go along. So I'm going to share my screen now. So I would like to touch on these 4 areas. The first being just how the complexity of library systems, has played out in trying to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. I will also touch a little bit about the role of the institution and the state, how we had, to work with these sets of guidelines, as well as, information coming from our colleagues and other personnel within the library. And then very briefly, I'll speak about some of our partnership efforts and the role of professional organizations in helping us handle this pandemic situation. A lot of what I'm going to say has already been touched on. So I'll try to avoid too much duplication, but I'll just kind of pull out some of the points that might be a little bit different. So in planning for services in a pandemic environment. One of the key things, of course, that I noticed was important was continual rapid planning and adjusting. And to that end, at UW-Madison, we had various planning groups. I remember we initially started with a COOP, continuity of operations planning group, and it had initially 20 something members, and then it grew to 30 something. And of course, with such a large group, we then had to think of focused areas. And so from the COOP planning group, then we created a COOP response team. And the response team was made up of leaders of specific areas that were engaged in this planning. Some people were dealing with the technology aspects, others were dealing with facilities and on-site services, others were dealing with virtual support, via chat and so on and so forth. So, and very quickly, because of the very intricate nature of that planning, we even had to have another layer of planning groups. And so then we created the expedited planning group to assist in the coordination of the planning information across a vast array of areas. Like other speakers have indicated, our institutions have, a lot of branch libraries on campus, and also different reporting structures. So a number of libraries on campus, for instance, the law library, the education library, and the health sciences library, they don't report through the central library system, which is known as the general library system. They report through their respective deans. So this planning effort had to be very coordinated to make sure that everyone was on board, because when our services are delivered, they are delivered as a cohesive continuum of support to all of the users of UW-Madison libraries. And so that collaboration in the planning was very important. As we continued to plan, there were specific phases and stages to the planning. Initially, when the governor's order came to be safer at home, there was an immediate lockdown, and the students were away on spring break. And at that point, there was a lot of intensive work happening, because after spring break, the spring semester, that is, was going to continue remotely with remote teaching. And so there was the work to happen to pivot all classes to remote teaching. The library was a key player in that effort, with our teaching and learning programs working with other units across campus to help facilitate that pivoting. And internally to the libraries, there was then a delineation of services. With the initial lockdown, then we began to open and make certain services available, such as the curbside pickup, where patrons, would make their requests via an online app and then be able to pick up the materials. But all of that was happening in an unfolding situation. And as we configured the services, we quickly realized that as we had some people working at home, and then others, a limited number, working on campus. For example, we were one of the very few institutions that continued to operate interlibrary loan services. Within the Big Ten Academic Alliance, I think we were one of 2 or 3. And so there was work going on to support the interlibrary loan services. We also continued to provide access to collection through this pickup service, where patrons went online and made their requests, and then material were made ready, and then they would have to set up appointments in order to pick up the material. And so that touched on the technology, people creating and modifying the app that permitted that, then front desk people being available to hand off materials as they're being collected, and then people behind the scenes doing some digitization work for chapters and so on and so forth that were being digitized in the interlibrary loan and resource sharing department and made available to patrons. All of this, together with an emphasis of the services of the library that are regularly available online. And I do feel like this gave us an opportunity to really highlight some of our online services and the kind of support that is not bound by a geographical location. So our liaison librarians and staff and personnel that support chat services, behind the scenes collection development was going on. And like an earlier presenter said, you know, there were ebook orders being fast tracked and so on and so forth. So it really was, I think, an opportunity to deliver a strong and robust continuum of support, because there had to be a strong connection between what we are doing in the physical spaces and what is happening remotely, all being handled by dispersed librarians and other personnel. And for example, when we did begin to reach the later stages of the planning, and then people could now make an appointment to come in and browse collections, there would be people, for example, who would go online on our chat service to ask questions about, you know, where do they go? They are in such and such a library location, and they are looking for such and such an item. So that question would be asked by somebody who is on site, but actually the personnel who are supporting the chat service could be anywhere at one of the remote locations. So this kind of highlights that there had to be a strong communication facet of all of this planning, so that as soon as services were planned, then everybody had to be on board and understand the scope, and the delineations of those different services, so that if they are either consulting with faculty and students remotely, they have an up-to-date picture of actually what is happening on site, as there were all these connections and interdependencies. There was a lot of adjustment needing to happen as we proceeded with the planning. And I'll give an example. In September, on the 10th, I think it was September 9th in the evening, a communication went out from the chancellor, and it was just barely a week or so after we opened for the fall semester, and the COVID numbers started to really track upwards. A decision was made to suspend on-site classes and pivot back to online only, because our fall semester is patterned on a hybrid system of some online classes, particularly for the large classes, and then some face-to-face classes for the smaller classes. So when the numbers started to track upwards rapidly, a decision was made to return to online only. So that decision was made effective immediately. And so on the 10th in the morning, where we had to quickly suspend the on-site services and adjust back to remote only. And so you can imagine, in the face of an unfolding situation where information is changing rapidly, one of the key elements of the planning was how quickly can we respond, how quickly can we adjust, how quickly can we incorporate new information coming out of campus administration, how quickly can we align our own plans with those campus guidelines as well as state guidelines? And sometimes these didn't necessarily align very tidily, and then there had to be layers of interpretation to make sure that we are continuing to prioritize the campus mission. One of the things that I want to also highlight that is that about how do you work with people during this kind of planning and delivery of services in a changing environment. That's perhaps one of the most impactful things. As Elaine and others have said, we are going through a very difficult time. The pandemic on one hand, and the racial issues on the other, as well as just people being in a place where they're not familiar with how to deal with the pandemic circumstances thrown at them. So it was very, very important in working with people, both employees as well as users, to have that empathetic approach and to really continue to elevate that spirit of mindfulness, because it got very stressful. And I can recall in one of our planning meetings, when we had been going and going and going, I remember finally saying, you know what, I am physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted. Because I mean, the minute you thought that you had just stood up the perfect service to address the needs that you had at hand, something else just appeared. And so in such an environment, I think working with people, assuring them, and I think we had the HR people were very working very hard to outline and share on the different ways that people could take COVID-related leave, for instance, so that they could work remotely. Some people actually were doing different work than what their normal work is. And others, of course, couldn't come on campus because either of health vulnerabilities, or they're working at home because schools were closed and they had toddlers to look after. So one had to really exercise deep empathy and understanding for the people. So I just want to say that was and continues to be a key element in responding to this COVID disruption. We paid close attention to the articulated institutional priorities, and all along those priorities were mostly research and instructional continuity. And in as far as the research and instructional continuity was concerned, I think it was important to differentiate some of the needs to cater for the disciplinary differences, whereas some disciplines, faculty and students were pretty comfortable working with online content and online services. There are some disciplines, such as the humanistic disciplines and the social sciences, that we really needed to think long and hard in how we were going to facilitate their access to print collections, particularly over the summer when the spring semester was over, and that's typically the time that faculty do their research. And so having access to the print collections for the humanistic disciplines was very important, as well for other disciplines. And I'm just emphasizing that the humanistic disciplines was really particularly hit hard by this inability to access collections. So we worked it out in such a way that we had these services set up, library by appointment, where they would go online and reserve a time, and within that time they'll be able to have access to the collections. Our library spaces were de-densified, and we only capped the number of people who would be able to come into the buildings to a certain manageable number, based on the spaces. So this appointment system continues to govern our services even now, and we project that that's what's going to be happening in the spring. So people make appointments to utilize our spaces. They make appointments to uh, 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 come in and or rather make reservations to come in and utilize the study rooms and so on. So appointments was, if I had to call out one thing, appointments were the blanket approach by which we delivered our on-site services. And of course, needless to say, the online services continued to expand, and instruction was pivoted online. And I'm talking here about library instruction. All of our librarians just began, to update and add to the LibGuides and other such materials that were then incorporated into our learning management system for students to leverage during their online learning. And I wanted to just mention the importance of getting feedback from users in the process of all this. And I just want to give a shout out to my colleagues in the unit of international and area studies. In a retreat that they held towards the end of summer, they invited a panel of faculty. I think there were 5 or 6 faculty members and a graduate student, to really just ask the questions about how the pandemic has affected them and how they are responding, and what the sort of support they needed going forward. And I think this was the single most important point of getting real voices of faculty and graduate students on the impact of this pandemic. And we heard how some of them were meant to travel over the summer to do research abroad, to visit various archives abroad, and we're no longer able to do so. Um, we heard from some how they are working, with empathy with their students, because their curriculum was very challenging to deliver in an online environment. And so that information has helped us, and also created opportunities for our librarians to collaborate with faculty to begin to tailor some of these services that we stood up really in a hurry, but to begin to tailor them to what their future needs might be. In that same vein, I want to give a shout out to University of Michigan. They conducted a very, very amazing study of faculty and students, again, touching on impact of the pandemic and what the needs of the users were. And that information shared through our Big Ten Academic Alliance regular meetings, we were able to glean a lot of useful information as we proceed to work with others. So I wanna sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I feel so bad. I feel like a criminal interrupting a wonderful conversation. But the time is kind of running out.
Yes.
If you will,
Yes,
please forgive
I'm
me.
actually winding up. So
Thank you.
through organizations like ARL, CRL, and Hathi Trust, as others have spoken, we were able to get enhanced access to content, regardless of and despite the challenges brought on by COVID. So I just want to end by thanking everyone for their presentations, and indicating that I'm happy to provide detailed information for those who might want to reach out and hear more about what we did at UW-Madison. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
so much, Leslie. Just 2 quick logistics questions. If you can stay for 5 minutes more after past 11, I'll be very grateful. I know Friday is, coming to an end for many on the East Coast, but our next speaker is a really illuminary. And I'm telling this because of my personal experiences dealing with her as a member of Salam, as a new Latin American Studies librarian. And she is a Salamist at court. Shout out to Salam colleagues. Pamela Graham is currently the Director of Humanities and Global Studies at Columbia University. She also leads the Center for Human Rights Documentation and Research at Columbia University Libraries. Graham earned her MA and PhD in Political Science from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a specialization in Latin American Studies. She learned the craft of librarianship at Duke University, where she was Caribbean Studies librarian and the interim Ibero-American Studies librarian. For 12 years, Graham was the Latin American and Iberian Studies librarian at Columbia University Libraries. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Lilidar, for all you've done to organize these conversations and for everyone who's helped arrange and coordinate today's session. It's really a pleasure to be on the panel with so many wonderful colleagues. And I thank Elaine for her very insightful framing remarks as well. I am mindful of the time, so I'll try to be brief and maybe selective about some of the experiences that I'll share from Columbia Libraries. As Lilidar said, I direct Humanities and Global Studies, so I have about 4 units that I direct that work in some area of humanities and/or global studies. And in turn, I report up to an associate university librarian for research and learning, just to maybe give you some context for where I'm positioned within my organization. So like many other libraries, we've gone through similar patterns and have restarted many services and or whipped up or reinvented other services so that we could expand access to collections. We actually have a limited ability to have students come on campus now and study in a few selected spaces in our libraries. I want to give a real shout out to our university librarian, Ann Thornton, who has been convening all staff chats throughout this period, which is not an easy thing to do across a large library organization, but it has really, I think, helped us have a cohesiveness where we have a way to be in touch and present with each other, even while we have to be apart through remote work. And it has opened up a transparency and an ability for people to ask questions and learn about what's going on. And I think that has gone a long way to address all the challenges of uncertainty that we all grapple with. That's especially true as New York City was one of the first epicenters and where we were facing a lot of challenging situations very early in the process of this pandemic. So I want to just make a few comments about research support and collections, since I work most directly in those areas. And a few things I'll just share as observations of what I think might be things we can learn or take from this time forward, and ways that we may be able to, in fact, gain from the challenging period that we've been going through. I think there's going to be what I would call a new hybridity for our teaching and research support services. Like many organizations, we kind of pivoted to doing a lot of online teaching. And while I think this has been extremely challenging for our colleagues who are primarily teaching faculty, and how it's been really difficult to reshape, semester-long courses to be effective through, this online format, I think for the kinds of teaching that libraries do, there can be real affordances to getting a lot more comfortable and familiar with Zoom or online modes of teaching. I think it's opened up more accessibility to what we have to offer. We have unprecedented numbers of people registering for sessions. And so I think we all have to think about the ways that this mode can coexist once we're back in a time where we might be able to work and teach in person, and how we might extend our reach and maybe reach new audiences by having a greater variety of methods to be delivering our instruction. We've had a lot of boosts in online, reference support through video consultations, et cetera. So I think that all is something that may reset what this means both for us and our users. And that could be something very positive. Even in areas where physical presence has been really important in teaching, like special collections, where we have object-centered learning, where it's really crucial to have physical contact with collections. I've seen a lot of creativity, both at Columbia and elsewhere, about how to at least replicate or approach replicating some of those experiences through having cameras, curators on site, sharing things, use of digital surrogates. So I think that even in places where we most want to be back in person, we may be able to evolve and maybe expand our repertoire of different ways we could interact and engage with users. And again, that may help diversify how and who we are able to reach and help us reach maybe new audiences to expand access to our services. One other quick example in our digital scholarship area, we used to have an open lab that people could come in and bring their device, bring their questions, share knowledge, get help. And for me, digital scholarship is really, it's less about technology than community. That's really the glue that is important in digital scholarship. So it's been really hard, obviously, in the last many months to support and encourage that kind of work in a library context. Two of our digital humanities, digital scholarship librarians have just started a kind of open lab that's using the platform of Twitch TV, where people can log in. And I kind of like to think of it as a digital humanities cooking show, where you get to watch them work live, building projects, interacting with people, fielding questions, and just trying to share out a bit of the experience of doing something together in a space. So I'm really excited about the possibilities of this moment, how it's pushed us, and how that can feed into the ways we might work when we get back to the place where we can once again be with people in person and share spaces. So just a few quick comments about collections, and then I'll wrap up. Again, being very mindful of time. So I've been really excited to see many of the statements that have been generated by different area studies organizations and other library professional organizations addressing some of the challenges of collecting in this moment. I have to give a shout out to Salam and my colleagues there who were kind of first out of the gate in some ways of getting a statement out about the impact of COVID on collecting. But there's been a wonderful process of other groups engaging with us, adding their own perspectives and adding to this conversation. And I'm really hopeful this is setting us up for really to be in a really good place to work together to move forward to seeing how we may reshape and some of the things Greg had mentioned about repositioning, resetting some of the ways we're thinking about collecting. This crisis has really made me very mindful of defining print in a very specific way. And that is, there is the sort of e-preferred, print preferred. There's the zone where content could be available in either content, and you've got choices to make over which you would like to acquire. But then there's so much knowledge that is print bound, where that is the only place that knowledge is being represented. And by extension, you could say physical media bound for things like film and music that is not getting distributed online or is not streaming, but is bound to physical media. So I think we have to be really careful at understanding where we have a choice to make a preference and where we're not being given much of a choice. And if we want the material, it's now or never. And if we don't acquire it, we may have longstanding gaps and losses to our scholarly community in what they are able to do. And that translates into questions of equity, because the digital divides are not accidental. They very much flow out of a whole host of conditions that prevail around publishing and access to information. So we have to be really careful that we aren't reinforcing any of those inequities in the choices we're making in this moment about collections and how we want to privilege digital access. I think we have a long way to go to think about that print-bound content, whether we could try to see more of that get digital through certain kinds of advocacy and work, and or whether we have to get even more strategic about how we coordinate around collecting whatever print we do need to get and how to store that in a much more collaborative way. So I think this moment is just maybe going to accelerate what we were already aware of needing to do, but where the stakes seem even higher now and the need even greater to work together to be much more strategic. I really urge, I know I urge my administrators and others not to take this particular moment and to create strategy that only is based on this moment, but to know that we have to get through certain things in this moment, but we have to strategize with a bit of a longer time frame so that we can think through these issues more fully and not be tied to only the restrictions that we face right now, but to take a longer time horizon when we come to crafting new and collaborative strategies. The last thing I'll say about the great set of statements that came out from different groups is that I think it's an important perspective for administrators to listen to, because these agreements, or I'm sorry, these statements were crafted through organizations that are largely membership organizations. And so I think they have an important grassroots nature to them, and they're cross-institutional. And I think it's really valuable to be getting feedback, ideas coming out of that kind of a context, which can be very different than the ideas we generate institutionally only within our own organizations. And so I think that again is a very positive development, and there's a lot we can learn from taking those statements very seriously and using them as a basis to determine how we can actually move forward into planning, action, and collaboration that will help lessen some of the more negative impacts of this moment and maybe help us bring any possible opportunities forward. So I'll stop there, and again, in mindfulness of time, and thank you again so much for including me in today's session.
I wanted to thank all of the panelists who found time, despite of their circumstances of being extremely busy, in the perfect storm, which Ellen had alluded to, but in being in different boats and people have to leave. So questions and answers, if you have any questions and answers, you might want to write them to me directly. My email address is in the chat box. I also want to apologize for an oversight, because there was a question, oh, you have not included any of the community college deans or southern universities, or it is always the bi-coastal conversation. What about the most part of the country which remains unrepresented? So I assure you that with your blessings, I will organize another webinar, but we all are going through Zoom fatigue. So I need to think very critically about how much time I can take from busy administrators. I wish you a good weekend. And unfortunately, if you have a quick minute for question, one question, is that okay to the panelist, or you have to leave? If you have to leave, I understand. David, Greg, Elaine. So the question is about the future. And the question is very complicated. How do you look at the tea leaves about the future and predict what's going to happen next? The only thing which is certain to me in these times is uncertainty, right? Like as Elaine mentioned, that this could go on for several more years. Some institutions can only hire federal work study students, no more graduate research associates and student workers. So we have assistant and associate professor librarians and curators on campus scanning low resolution materials for the patrons. This is, in my understanding, not sustainable. University allows only for spending directly that supports teaching. We are missing out on materials for research to maintain our collections. Can please one of the committee members quickly address some of these issues?
Well, I don't know how quickly I can address it, so I'll only touch it and just say, you know, the strategic thinking about that question, about the future, forces us to really zero in on how we add value to the academic, research, teaching and learning enterprise. What is it? What can we focus on? Keeping in mind, it's not just the restrictions, as many have pointed out, it's not just the restrictions as per the pandemic, which could last an indefinite period. We are in a budget crisis nationally, and we don't know how long any of that's going to last. And the biggest danger, in my view, is what's been referred to as the psychology of scarcity. When the wrong decisions are made under conditions of scarcity, scarcity of people, scarcity of resources, and cutting back to what's understood as the core without thinking about how collaboration among the libraries, you know, can allow us, as many of us have understood for a long time, to focus on the unique things we can do to add to the overall value of the community of libraries. So that's a whole giant narrative that goes along with that, but I do think it's a danger, the sort of panic of scarcity causing us to circle the wagons, pull back in, and focus on some kind of core that winds up being sort of vanilla across all our collections and all our services, rather than how we can add most value collectively.
Any other speakers want to chime in, or we are all good? I do not like to take Celine, of course, yes.
No, I'm just going to say, I mean, you have to create the future you want to have. You cannot predict it. You know, people have tried it, it doesn't work very well. And so I think, you know, what David is bringing up, we're talking about quality and not just focused on quantity. And so changing our business, the things that were important are not important anymore. The way I look at space now is very different than the way I looked at space back in January. So I think we're going to have to completely rethink how we use space, how collections are used, our users' expectations are changing. And so I think this is a pivotal moment to recast our value in a very different kind of way with less money. So it's not going to be easy, but I think there's an opportunity there to just completely change our business and how we deliver it to the campus.
Thank you so much, Elaine. I wanted to thank each of the panelists for taking time out of their busy schedule. I know I'm repeating the same thing, but it means a lot to me. As a librarian, I cannot be political. I have personal opinions, but all I will ask you is, based on Elaine's opening remarks, go out and vote, express your thought. That's what we can do to preserve our democracy, which is fragile, but we should do our utmost best. So I wish you a very peaceful weekend, and stay safe. Thank you, attendees and participants, for your questions, and I apologize. I'll try to correct that next time if the chance is given. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
See you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.